Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Atlantic Council event, the Hypersonic Imperative, Defending the Homeland and Deterring Adversaries. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm a Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Senior Director of the Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the final report from the Atlantic Council's Hypersonic Capabilities Task Force. The bipartisan task force is the culmination of 12 months of effort to address how the Pentagon and U.S. allies and partners should approach the fielding of hypersonic strike weapons and counter-hypersonic defenses. It also builds on years of work done here at the Scowcroft Center, where we have examined the future of strategic forces, missile defense, and emerging technologies, including hypersonics, as core components of deterrence in an era of great power competition. I'd very much like to thank the sponsors of this task force, Amero, Booz Allen Hamilton, GE Aerospace, Hadrian, Hermeus, Kratos, Lockheed Martin, Nominal, RTX, Spectre Aerospace, and Ursa Major for making this important work possible. The United States faces perhaps the most challenging security environment since the end of World War II, with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea increasingly working together as an axis of aggressors that together threaten U.S. and allied interests and raise the prospect of simultaneous conflict across multiple theaters. Increasingly capable and coordinated, both China and Russia have built their military planning around anti-access area denial strategies designed to hold U.S. and allied forces at risk across every domain. These systems were developed explicitly to counter the traditional strengths of the U.S. military, its ability to project power globally, sustain freedom of maneuver, and maintain battlefield dominance. In this environment, deterring, and if necessary, defeating these threats will require the United States to penetrate highly contested environments and destroy hardened, time-sensitive targets. The capability that opens this door is hypersonic strike. Hypersonic weapons offer the ability to deliver precise, survivable, and lethal effects at long range and within the critical time frame of relevance. If the United States were to develop and field these systems in meaningful numbers, it would preserve credible deterrence and ensure U.S. warfighting preeminence in an era of great power competition. For years, legions of U.S. engineers and scientists have worked tirelessly to advance hypersonic technology, supported by substantial research and development investment. Yet, despite these efforts, our first-generation systems have not yet been fielded, and without a clear pathway to affordable capacity, the prospects for second-generation systems remain uncertain. Meanwhile, China and Russia continue to expand and operationalize their hypersonic arsenals. The United States can no longer afford to fall behind. Budgetary constraints and shifting Pentagon priorities have delayed deployment and muted the industrial demand signals necessary to scale production. To restore leadership, the United States should pursue the hypersonic imperative, develop counter-hypersonic capabilities as part of the Golden Dome architecture, and dedicate a concerted effort to maturing reusable hypersonic aircraft. Today's event will feature two distinguished panels that will show the path forward to seizing this imperative. Our first panel will feature a discussion with the esteemed co-chairs of our task force, Secretary Deborah Lee James, 23rd Secretary of the Air Force and Atlantic Council Board Director, and Secretary Ryan McCarthy, 24th Secretary of the Army. The conversation will be moderated by Stephen Rodriguez, Forward Defense Senior Advisor and founder of One Defense. This panel will discuss the significance of the task force's work and the broader security context facing the United States today. Today's event will continue with the conversation featuring the report's author and members of the task force: Michael White, former Principal Director for Hypersonics in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering; Whitney McNamara, non-resident Senior Fellow here at the Scowcroft Center and Senior Vice President at Beacon Global Strategies; and General James McConville, former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. These conversations the second panel will be moderated by Mark Massa, Deputy Director of our Forward Defense Program. The second panel will explore the Hypersonic Capabilities Task Force's key findings and recommendations in depth. Convenings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. And the Center also honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Housed within the Scowcroft Center, our Forward Defense Program generates ideas and connects stakeholders across the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States and its allies and partners, Our work shapes defense strategies, capabilities, and partnerships essential for deterring threats and prevailing in future conflicts. This conversation is public and on the record. There will be opportunities for all of you in the audience to ask questions. Those of you watching online can also submit questions by going to askac.org. So thank you all again very much for joining us today. And without further ado, I'd like to turn to the moderator of our first panel, Stephen Rodriguez. Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who've joined us here. We have a packed house, and also all of you online. I would encourage you, as my friend Matt Krennick just said, we encourage you to pose your questions. Go to askac, that's Alpha Charlie, askac.org, and you can ask any question you want. I just can't guarantee that anyone will answer it, starting with myself. So, look, the goal of this is to be useful, entertaining, and informative. I would like to say in that order. We're going to try not to talk at you, but really have a conversation. And hopefully it will be useful for all of you, just as much as this past year-long effort has been useful for us as well. So the genesis of this task force started last year with a simple basic question. Why can't we seem, and by the way, this may sound familiar with a lot of things in this country, why can't we see in the field this capability that everyone says we need, and not just field it, but why can't we seem to field this in any kind of useful or reasonable numbers as well? So that's what we embarked, I think, this past 12 months to try to help address. We followed a similar template as we have with some of the commissions, in that we had a very short report and 10 recommendations. And some of these will be things that we'll get into in this panel as well. We realize you probably haven't read the report yet, although we kept it short enough that it wouldn't surprise me if those of you kind of quickly dug into it and got the gist of it. So I think we'll jump right into this. We have our two co-chairs here. Matt's already introduced them. So starting out, and this is a question I'll kind of pose to both of you in the forward that both of you wrote. The U.S. is at a critical juncture when it comes to fielding hypersonic capabilities. So would love to hear from your perspective, Debbie, starting with you, and then Ryan. What's the nature of the threat that we're facing from our adversaries on hypersonic weapons, and why do you feel this task force is so urgently needed now, like in 2025? Please.
Well, thank you, and I want to join with others and thank all those in the audience today for turning out, as well as for those who are listening online or who will listen online, because you have choices in what you can do with your time, and we're grateful that you're giving some attention to what we feel is an important and timely subject and report, and that is the subject of hypersonics. I think Matt Krennick did a great job of outlining the threats. The number one and number two threats, at least in my view, that the United States and our allies face around the world today are in the form of China and Russia, both of whom have military capability, and they have stated intentions to take actions, and indeed have taken certain actions that threaten our interests around the world, that threaten 80 years worth of the international rules of the road, that threaten the sea lanes of the South China Sea, for example. And although Russia is not the behemoth that China is economically or militarily, if you don't think they're dangerous, just ask anybody from Ukraine. So those are the two threats, I would say. These are our peer competitors, and as you heard, they have this, what we have coined as the anti-access aerial denial strategy, which simply put, they have watched how the US and our allies have operated over the course of decades, and they have now put in place a series of approaches to include advanced air defense systems, command and control nodes, space capabilities, cyber capabilities, and super fast weapons, hypersonic weapons, which when put together is what we now call anti-access aerial denial, and it's designed to essentially keep us out and push us away from being able to defend our interests around the world, as well as to launch against us should we get into open warfare, God forbid. So we feel like this is a very timely report, because although there's not a single silver bullet for what the United States must do, there's a series of things that the United States must do. One area where we are particularly lagging is in this area of hypersonics, which although we've made progress and although systems have been in the research and development phase for years, we have yet to field a capability. So no fielded capabilities, certainly not a fielded capability in the numbers at scale that we feel that we need. So it's time to get busy, and that's what this report is all about. It's designed to put forth some actionable recommendations so that we reverse course and that we get going on this very important topic of fielding a capability for hypersonics.
Brian, why now? Why should we be doing this now?
So really it's finishing things that I started when I was in the department. The spring of 2018, after a staff meeting that I sat in for Secretary Esper when I was the Undersecretary of Army, Secretary Mattis pulled me off the side afterwards and said, we need to get going on hypersonics. And I was like, hypersonics, I think I know what that is. And I literally walked down the hall and I meet with General McConville, who was the Vice Chief of Staff at the time. And we established an organization which became the offspring of the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office. Mm-hmm. And we had an enormously talented officer, a guy named Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood, we put in charge of this. And we went after it. And by the spring of 2020, we tested a common hypersonic glide body out in the Pacific and, we declassified much of it. It had tremendous performance, but it took us almost a year and a half to take one shot. We proved that the technology can work, but we were buying $41 million missiles. So very quickly, success found a tremendous economic hurdle, but also just the challenge of partnering with the other services, and we partnered very well with the Navy at the time, but to try to find economies of scale and a means to put these on platforms and deploy them around the world. The Army relies a lot on real estate. We would have to have partners that would allow us to house these batteries worldwide. So there was a lot of moving pieces associated with just the tough economic and technological hurdles. But the department's had a history of working on hypersonics. There was a lot of effort made in the first term, the end of the Bush II and the first term of Obama. But then in 2011, sequestration hits. And then the department had a brutal 5-year horizon, much of Secretary James's tenure of fighting difficult priorities. We're in sustained combat operations. So the department's had a rough ride. It's always been a priority, but now as we face a digital world, a much more digital world, network-centric world, the speed of decision-making, the range of weapons, it has to come back to the top and be a priority that we've got to finish the job.
So one of the central frameworks that we articulate in the report is something called Integrated Comprehensive Layer Defeat, or ICLD. If you want to know more about it, read the report. And in it, it articulates that an effective defense essentially requires a good offense, right? So this is where we get into kinetic strike, and obviously you can imagine how difficult it is to try to articulate these concepts in an unclassified environment. These systems and capabilities become sensitive very, very quickly. But I think we did a pretty good job. From your perspective, and maybe we'll start with you again, how does this concept of left of launch, as we call it, left of launch focus, change how the Army or the Air Force, in your case, should be thinking about their roles and investments, in a conflict with a future peer competitor like Russia or China?
Well, just from the Air Force perspective, the role of the Air Force is, and I think it would be, even in a world where we had hypersonic capabilities at scale, the role is, particularly in the earliest days, to go forward and to take out as many of these A2AD capabilities as possible. And of course, left of launch is a fancy way of saying before it launches, because it's obviously, if you can take it out before it launches, it ought to be an easier, safer proposition than trying to take it out or while it's in air or in space, or God forbid it hits one of our bases or our homeland. So that's the proposition, how to take that out, how to take out as much of that as quickly as possible. By the way, we need certainly more investments in hypersonics. For the Air Force, we have 2 systems that are either ready or near ready. Arrow and HACM are the 2 that are ready or near ready to go into production. And again, these have been in R&D. They've had some technical difficulties. They're not considered to be terribly affordable at the moment. So this question of affordability is one that we really need to, industry and government together, work and figure out how to do this better. So we need more investments there to get these systems that are ready or near ready fielded at some degree of scale, because having some capability in this area is better than none, and none is what we've got at the time being. With that said, the Air Force has advanced aircraft that can deliver various types of missiles, and this is the way that we would do it today. It would require putting pilots at risk, and again, do we have the scale that we need to do what we think would be necessary in an out-and-out war? That's the big question. That's where hypersonics would fill an important gap. So, but I also want to say, left of launch, there's other ways that perhaps can get the job done to take out this capability before it does harm to us or to our forces. So we need additional investments, not only in hypersonics, the stuff that goes boom, but we need more investments in cyber, we need more investments in space, other enabling capabilities, electronic warfare. So these other approaches also need to be invested in for the future.
So Ryan, yeah, obviously, like Debbie was Air Force Secretary, you were Army Secretary. When you think about ICLD and this concept of left of launch, how do you think about the Army's kind of operational role? And then as Service Secretary, how do you think about investments from an Army perspective, especially when you consider kind of a lot of the joint or kind of OSD level investments also trying to be pushed or flowing down?
The real magic for hypersonic delivery would be off of an aerial platform. It would defeat the physics challenge that you face from deploying them from the ground. But for the Army, it's geometry, it's the real estate. Where are they placed globally? Are we in Alaska, parts of Northern Europe? Are we in the supporting operations in the South China Sea? And those are many reasons why multi-domain task forces were developed by the Army, because of the non-kinetic and kinetic effects that Secretary James was talking about. All those complementary factors coming together to deter conflict, and then if necessary, become this very unique weapon system that can change the dynamics very quickly in a kinetic event. So for us, it's always geometry. Where are we postured around the world and the way we can support the joint fight?
Let's stick with you. And actually, before I get going, I also want to thank, I know we recognize the companies, but I want to thank a lot of our task force members who are here right now. Thank you very much for all of your support. This is a people endeavor, and I want to recognize you as well. Thank you so much for all of your support in helping us get to this point. I hear we have some shutdown specials at the reception afterwards, so I'm sure you'll be even more enthusiastic at that point. Ryan, when we think about first-generation weapons, like in this, while we didn't call it out explicitly, the Army's long-range hypersonic weapon, from your perspective, how critical is it for the Army not just to field this weapon, but also do it in substantial numbers to address as Debbie was highlighting, the A2AD challenge? And I guess what are some of the biggest hurdles? Obviously budgetary is always one of them, but also doctrinal as well. We often will discuss, hey, what's the role of what's the Army's role in a Westpac fight, as an example. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like what are some of the biggest challenges to getting this fielded from your experience or from your work on the task force?
So you think about when we started this pursuit in the first term of the Trump administration, it was us getting out of the INF treaty. And it was a great decision, one I was very supportive when the president did that. But it provided the opportunity to now pursue and develop these types of weapons. And I believe the Army's pursuit today could be the Pershing missile of this century and be one that could uniquely deter conflict in Eastern Europe, in the South China Sea, because of its capability. Now, obviously the budgetary concerns I mentioned before, the cost per missile that we faced, as recent as about 6 or 7 years ago. But there's also, from a doctrinal standpoint, the dynamic nature of targeting, how you're going to put together, and the Army's pursuing this today, the Next Generation Command and Control, something I'm a big supporter of as well, and they're putting a lot of money against that. But to be able to use AI and targeting to increase the speed to not only obviously find the targets, but cue weapon systems to prosecute threats. So I think that it'll be a game-changing capability for them. The question is the deployment and the volume. I mean, it really comes down to which appendix you're trying to support in a contingency plan for a combatant commander, but the numbers will be higher and economics will be a huge factor. General McConville will come up here later and he can talk about the challenges of developing the traditional tracks of artillery and missile defense officers in the U.S. Army to converting them to now managing these incredibly sophisticated weapon systems, the targeting systems associated with that. It'll be a generational change and a huge hurdle for the department to chase.
So Debbie, speaking of hurdles, how should, from an Air Force perspective, how should the service think about balancing the need to field first-generation systems, right? So we've been investing in these, we've been trying to develop them. Obviously, there's a chance to field these now. We have this hypersonic imperative, and yet we're also talking about investing in more advanced, maybe second-generation hypersonic systems. So if you were to put your service secretary hat back on, how would you think about kind of balancing the need to field, current, systems that have high potential vis-a-vis investing in longer-term, more advanced capability?
If I were in this seat today and given the choice between the two, I would get busy right away with doing everything possible to field at reasonable scale the weapons that are ready or near ready today. First things first, the old adage of first things first. Again, we have zero fielded capability, and we need to get something in the arsenal as soon as possible, in my opinion. Now, with that said, we are expected in the department to be able to do multiple things at once, so we can't totally close our eyes to the future. So there's where the B word comes in. You said it, balance. There needs to be some sort of balance. So I would put the current generation, and by the way, be thinking about block upgrades with that current generation, but I would still put that first. But I would also try to get going with an initiative that would be thinking about the future of the next generation of weapons. And I really like the approach that the Space Force has taken in a number of areas where they're putting technical people together with operators, together with acquisition officials. They're tiger teaming it. They call them mission deltas, but it doesn't matter what we call it. The point is to get these different disciplines together, to be talking about the issues. What's the art of the technical possibility, I guess I would say here, for the next generation, and iterate on the ideas. And by the way, invite in industry, because we talked about affordability earlier and how these first-generation weapons are quite expensive. Wow, we can't afford to have that for the next generation. So affordability has to be built in from the get-go, and we need industry's ideas, or I should say the department needs industry's ideas on what are the incentives, what are the roadblocks for industry to be able to ramp up, do it quickly, be able to produce, and get that price point down per weapon. So I would get busy on that effort, the thinking part, but I would start producing and trying to field as quickly as possible the first generation.
So one of our recommendations is recommending the creation of a munitions czar, or for those of you familiar with this term, a DRPM, or Direct Reporting Manager for weapons. And I'm going to read this part because I think this is a very important point. The goal of this was to combat what it describes as a service bias that prioritizes large platforms, ships, planes, tanks, while weapons programs become the bill payer. So the service bias tends to prioritize the large platforms at the expense of weapons programs, which end up getting harvested for dollars. So from your perspective, and maybe Ryan, we can start with you. Do you agree with that assessment, of a platform bias, that is, not the munitions are. That's already written down. But do you agree with that assessment around the platform bias? What was your experience in the Army? And then, I think we articulate a lot of benefits of a DERPM, but what do you see as potential pitfalls that the current administration should be aware of as they seek to implement this?
Platform bias was easy for the Army. We put it on a truck. It's a lot harder when you have to make a decision on whether it's a Virginia-class submarine or a destroyer, and now you're looking at, in particular for surface vessels, the configuration of a surface combatant. I mean, that was way harder for them. I'd always give them the benefit of that challenge. But with respect to DERPA, I have a lot of history with this. I worked for Defense Secretary Robert Gates during the Bush and then the first term of Obama, and he created the ISR task force, the MRAP task force, medevac task force, counter IED, and it creates a tremendous amount of energy. And you can get the whole department literally locked in solving problems. And the only thing that I regret, and I guess partly my fault because I helped write the memo, was how do you institutionalize all of the things that you're going to create? If you go back and look at the end state, the predicate, hundreds of lives were saved. Prosecuted a lot of targets and got rid of a lot of bad people. But ultimately, how did you institutionalize that over time and learn from all the things that you did at ISR? How many MRAPs are in the formation today? None, right? So, I mean, if you think about that, I point the thumb, not the finger. You were creating energy because you were in conflict. You had casualties. Walter Reed was full. We were burying 5-6 soldiers a day. It was about turning things around and winning. And that was remarkable. But I think that when, have the experience of going on to serve as in a senior roles in the services, it's about bringing the services along with you and institutionalizing that so that generations learn how to do this and perfect it over time, and it becomes a part of professional military education, and it becomes cultural. I was an infantry officer. You learn these things over decades, but you learn it from people as much as you learn it from a manual. So I think it's a great idea. It's a way to create the energy and the focus. Just hope they write a better memo than I did for my boss back then.
Well, Debbie, from your perspective, what are some of the benefits and why have a DERPM now? Obviously, the immediacy of the threat is certainly a major driver, but why not just let this, I don't want to say business as usual because that sounds derisive, but why not just task this out to the services to go build?
Well, first of all, I think Ryan said it very well because I too have lived through some of the examples that he gave. There is only really 1 or 2 people in the department who have the ultimate authority to pull the resources, to direct the people across the military services, to create priorities that are overarching. That's the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary. Those are basically the 2 individuals. And either to have one of them directly manage an effort as Robert Gates managed MRAP, or to have someone who directly reports to them manage an effort, someone who has direct access, someone who has their ear, someone who shares the sense of urgency. I have seen it make all the difference in the world for focus and attention and delivering money and making the services sit up and reprioritizing. It works, but I think Ryan also makes a great point. Just like we've said now for years, when we go in massively with a military operation, we have to do so while also thinking about the day after. After the conflict ends, what do we do now? It's a little bit like he just described. Once we have this major effort and we move mountains, and again, the department can move mountains and has done it before, but then how do you institutionalize it? How do you make sure it lives on? How do you make sure that it becomes cost effective? To give more attention to this up front, I think, is an excellent point, and one that if this recommendation is agreed to, hopefully this after piece would also be thought through. And again, this idea of having a czar, a senior leader, this administration has adopted this for the Golden Dome, for certain other categories. So I think it sort of fits with an approach. But the day after and what do we do next is an excellent point that hopefully we do better at thinking that through.
Well, Secretary James had brought it up. I wholeheartedly agree when we were doing the work in the task force. And I just have learned from this experience and should have wrote a better memo back then too.
Well, Ryan, let's keep going with you. The report also stated that the current industrial base is simply not equipped or incentivized to innovate, design, and build affordable hypersonic weapons in mass, right? Affordable hypersonic weapons in mass. What policy changes or contracting incentives do you feel are most important or useful to help get at this affordable hypersonic capability? I think we mentioned at the outset, or someone did, like $41 million or something for
and that was 7 years ago. But if you think of a lot of the things that have come out in executive orders and are being discussed with department directives, and we're going to see a lot from Secretary Hegseth here soon, is the investments that are coming out of the big, beautiful bill in the industrial base. And once those dollars start flowing, will you see the fundamental changes ranging from shipyards to manufacturing capacity here in the country? A lot of it's going to depend on where those dollars get distributed. Because if they do go to these manufacturers, they're going to find a way to really wring out costs in the supply chain. And can they refine manufacturing processes so that we can get that per unit cost down? And you got to have that demand signal that's got to come from the department of just how many they want. But there's a lot of capital that's going to flow into the system and other tools at the disposal of industry like OSC and these others for financing to get into these businesses at scale. So you see a lot of energy from a macro level coming. It's how it lands is going to be a big part of whether or not you'll see success here in hypersonic missile development.
Debbie?
Yeah, I would say to build on Ryan's answer, the department needs to say to industry something like, this is the capability that we need, and we want it pretty fast, so there's a time frame involved there, and this is a price point that we have in mind. Now, those three elements somehow need to be written ultimately into a contract, and there has to be stable funding and a signature at the bottom of the page of the contract for industry to respond. And by the way, the government can't, or I would argue shouldn't, write those three elements into a contract in all by itself without first discussing it with industry, because you have to understand what the art of the possible is. Because ultimately what we're asking for, or what the department would be asking for under that scenario, is this is the type of behavior that we are looking for and the results and the outcomes that we want. What do you, industry, need in the way of incentives? What do you need into this contract to make it happen? How can you, industry, focus on, I think it's the manufacturing / producibility part of the equation that would ultimately drive these price points down. So what does industry need beyond a signed contract and stable funding to get there from here? Now, some of what Ryan already has discussed, some of the acquisition reform, if you will, changes of recent years, I think are going to certainly help when it comes to speed and innovation generally. So, for example, doing away or heavily modifying the JSIDS process. Now that was, for all of perhaps the good that was intended, it really did slow things down. The focus on commercial solutions, I think, is very positive. Removing administrative barriers generally, or at least the effort to remove those barriers generally. All of this will help speed and innovation, provided, of course, that it filters down to the right people in the acquisition workforce, and provided that they implement. I'm not sure any of those things directly, however, talk to this question of reducing the price point of weapons. And again, we really need, the department is going to need the input from industry and specific ideas from industry on how to help more there.
I was just thinking the one thing I would love to do away with, which in many ways summarizes my professional career as well, if I'm being honest, is that term selected but not funded. So I think to your point, having stable funding and actually being selected and aligned with that funding is a low but necessary bar. I'm almost Winchester on questions. I have one question left for both of you in closing, but let me ask a question from the audience here on screen. This one's from Brad Smith that says, and I think this is an interesting one given what we talked about in the green room. What lessons should be learned from past high-tech defense initiatives that could help avoid pitfalls in hypersonic capability development? Obviously, we've all been around and seen a number of waves. You mentioned MRAPs, which is not necessarily high-tech, but certainly done in extremis. What past high-tech defense initiatives could we learn from to help avoid some of these pitfalls that we're talking here, whether they be budgetary, doctrinal, what have you? Feel free to answer that. Maybe Ryan, if you want to start.
Sure, because you're talking about pitfalls. I've probably got a laundry list of things that I've been a part of. When we were, Jim McConville and I were paired up in the Army, we were trying to make a TACMS multi-domain because it performs so well and we love it, and soldiers are trained on it, and you have generations of soldiers. And we were trying to make it multi-domain, and it just wasn't. And we were throwing money at it, and we realized we were never going to get there. And then we just had lunch with the Secretary of the Navy and the CNO, and we said, we want to buy SM-6 and Tomahawks. They dropped their forks, like, what? So we wanted to do that to get medium-range missiles. And those are the ones that are deployed in the South China Sea today, and they're in the Philippines and other places and getting people's attention over there. And you just come to a realization that your sunk costs here, you're just not moving the needle. And at the end of the day, there may be somebody who has a better idea than you. And so we did that with the SM series and land-based Tomahawk, and we either painted beat next to the Navy or scraped Navy off those missiles, and we just put them on TELs and we put them in Army units. And they're deployed today. So a lot of times it's just the leadership just having the courage to realize they're wrong and that the technology's not going to get there, and we can keep investing in research, but turn to options that are going to work here in the interim. It's still a successful capability that's served the country very well for a very long time, and we're going to keep stretching to try to get greater range and greater capability, but making a hard decision when you're not moving the needle.
And I feel when you and I first met, as proof of, I don't know, one of us keeps making bad life choices because we keep ending up here on stage together. You brought up your experience with what's now called B-21, and I think at one point during our deliberations, I think on the Defense Innovation Commission, we were talking about how did that kind of get expedited into the market or into the air in this case, and I think you used a term that I remember you said we checked the checkers, checking the checkers.
Well, we tried to get rid of the checkers, checking some of the checkers. Yeah,
That's
that
right.
was one of the lessons of B-21. By the way, B-21 did pick a price point, so that we kind of backed into that price point. So that might be an example. And that program, from what I understand, is going
moving ahead.
reasonably well. Of course, I was Secretary of the Air Force when it launched.
You're welcome.
But I wanted to say, in response to the question, in addition to some of the ideas we've talked about already, and we've talked about big industry input up front to understand what the art of the possible, what are the incentives that are needed. One thing we haven't yet uttered the S word, software. Watch out for the software aspects, because most of these weapon systems, of course, are heavily, heavily dependent on software with some kind of casing around it that allows it to ultimately survive and explode. So to make sure that the software aspects are considered up front and the complexity of the software, I think that is another lesson learned. Certainly when I was secretary, all of the major systems problems that I dealt with came back to software problems. So
Interesting.
big
There's
lesson
more
learned for me.
software in a F-35 than the space shuttle. I always
That's
loved
right,
that.
by a lot.
I always loved that, yeah.
We have one other question from John Watts. John Watts is an excellent partner to the Atlantic Council and correcting for all the spelling errors in his question. What role does the research and industrial bases, especially industrial bases of our allies, particularly our AUKUS allies, that's Australia, UK, US, for those of you who've been in a hole the last 5 years, play in getting to an operational capability? So what role does the research base and industrial base of our allies play in helping us get to an operational capability with respect to hypersonics?
Well, this, of course, was one of the recommendations that is in our report, namely that we certainly should work allied cooperation. AUKUS was specifically mentioned as a good place to start. So the allies do have certain capabilities, and we should be working very closely with them. We intend to fight with them. So it's appropriate that we co-develop and look to do as much cooperation as possible.
Are you good?
I mean, I can remember as a 28-year-old walking into a hangar in Oman and seeing British SAS. I mean, we should do everything possible with our allies. So went through some long, hard days with those guys. I mean, you can rely on them, and they're going to perform, and they have a great industrial capacity in both those countries, and it just brings us more scale. Absolutely.
So this report, we ultimately titled it a call to action. We laid out 10 recommendations. I encourage you guys to read it. If you can ensure that the Department of War, or Department of Defense, DBA, Department of War, and Congress fully implement any of these recommendations, especially in the next fiscal year, which one would it be? And maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll give Ryan the last word.
So I'm going to disobey your request, and I'm going to pick two. But I'm going to pick the czar idea, the idea of having a direct reporting official to the secretary or the deputy secretary, because again, I believe that's how you move mountains in a very complex, large organization like the department. But caveated with Ryan's point, which I think is excellent, the day after, you have to give thought to how do you institutionalize after some of this energy dissipates, after the capability perhaps is in place. I said two, however, so the other one that I hope the czar would take on as the first order of business is to get busy and let's get these first generation weapons in the different services that are ready or near ready. Let's get them fielded at reasonable scale, because I come back to, at present, we got nothing, and we got to get something on the books as soon as possible.
Right?
I'm shoulder to shoulder with the wingman here. I think that the value, one of the other aspects or value of having that DPRM is they can sit there with the senior leadership, Secretary of Defense, and every O plan will be looked at. And you can really back into the math with how many of those missiles they would need to support the various contingencies worldwide, and really help industry at the same time of ensuring you're meeting requirements for combatant commanders worldwide. So.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our co-chairs and also our task force for this excellent work. We'll be followed by another panel that will be up here after a brief break. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to our in-person audience and those joining online for the second panel of this launch event for the Atlantic Council's Hypersonic Capabilities Task Force. My name is Mark Massa, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Forward Defense Program at the Atlantic Council, which conducts the Council's U.S. defense policy work and which has been pleased to host this task force over the past 12 months. It's my pleasure to introduce three panelists joining me today. On my far left, we have Mike White, who is the lead author of this task force. Mike has a more than 4-decade career working on hypersonic issues, including at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, leading their air and missile defense section, as the inaugural principal director for hypersonics in the Pentagon, and now as an independent consultant where he works with a variety of clients involved in the hypersonic space. Next to him, we have Whitney McNamara, who served as another task force member on the Hypersonic Capabilities Task Force. Whitney is a senior vice president at Beacon Global Strategies and a non-resident senior fellow at Forward Defense. At Beacon, she leads on national security technology, and she's been the author of several other commission-style reports we've done on defense innovation and adoption. And last, but certainly not least, directly to my left is General Jim McConville, who is the 40th Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the senior-most uniformed officer, and held a variety of positions of increasing responsibility in the Army with distinguished service abroad. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists the same question, which is, we've just come out with this report that you've all been working on in a different capacity over a long time. What's the one message that you hope that our audience takes away from this report? And we'll start from my left to further on.
You know, from where I sit is we need this arrow in our quiver. And why do we need hypersonics? Because we need the speed, we need the range, we need the precision, and quite frankly, using convergence, it just gives us a capability that, you know, when Secretary McCarthy and I served, you know, when we talked to combatant commanders, that's what they wanted. They want this capability to reach out and deter foes, and so it's something I just think we need. It's not a silver bullet, but it's something that we should have.
Yes, sir. Whitney.
For any tech adoption problem, I'm always thinking about the broader ecosystem. And in this case, I think the broader ecosystem is how are we looking across the industrial base of one of the wealthiest, most diverse, industrial bases in the world, and using that for our strategic advantage. And to that end, too, I look at the broader tech adoption ecosystem, right? We're not adopting tech in a vacuum. So I'm looking at things like test and evaluation infrastructure, data management strategies, things that can really make or break whether or not tech is successfully adopted.
Thanks, Whitney. Mike?
Thanks, Mark. First, before I answer the question, I want to acknowledge the work of Secretary James and Secretary McCarthy and my fellow panelists and the other people on the working group for this phenomenal perspective provided as we put the report together, both from the industry side, the acquisition side, the warfighter side. And so acknowledge everybody and thank them very much. I look at the movie Top Gun, and I'm going to steal a line, the need for speed. And when we talk about hypersonics, we think about the widget, the thing that's flying hypersonic speeds. That's what we immediately think of, and that's a critical part of it. But it really is speed in a multi-domain look. We need speed of acquisition. We need to get this to the warfighter, because right now there's a capability gap that needs to be closed, and we need to do that as quickly as possible. So speed to the warfighter is an important part. Speed of delivery of capability and getting mass out to the warfighter and getting capability fielded for just deterrent sake. And then speed associated with delivering effects in the broad kill chain, not just the fly the missile to the point perspective, but how do I do what I need to do to compress the front end of that kill chain, because the time scale on the battlefield is critical. And we need to be able to fight within the speed of relevance on the battlefield, and these systems allow us to do all of that.
Good, thanks, Mike. And yeah, clear messages that also come through in our final report, so I encourage everyone to read it. If you haven't already seen, there's a little business card on all of your seats if you're here in the in-person audience. So if you want to get a copy of the report, that's a good place to start. Let's talk a little bit more about why hypersonics. We've seen our adversaries field these systems. We've seen Russia employ them in the battlefield in Ukraine. We saw a recent military parade in Beijing where systems that were likely hypersonic were demonstrated. What are our adversaries up to in this space, and why should the United States care? What does it matter for our deterrence and warfighting potential? And I'll ask all the panelists to respond to that in reverse order. So Mike, you can start.
All right, great, thanks. I think if you look at, and Secretary McCarthy referenced this in his remarks, When we were in the INF treaty, we were limited at which systems we could deliver, and at the time, ballistic missiles were really the mechanism to deliver effects at speed, and we limited ourselves. The Chinese weren't part of the INF treaty, so they pressed ahead very, very aggressively to not only field ballistic missiles, but hypersonic weapons in large numbers. And so where we find ourselves now is with a capability gap, in particular with China, but also with Russia and others who are now fielding capabilities, as you can read in the open reports. So we have to make sure that we close that gap, because our traditional subsonic systems that not only take hours to fly hundreds of miles, but take hours to mission plan because they are vulnerable and they fly low and slow, we have to be able to compress that time scale on the battlefield, compress the time with which we deliver our effects, so that we can compete on the battlefield in a future conflict.
I'd say the advantages, of course, are always worrying that Russia and China have anytime they want to pursue highly destructive weapons. I would characterize some of these advantages as narrow. We've already seen Western-provided air defenses be able to shoot down some Russian hypersonic missiles in Ukraine. However, that doesn't mean with greater investment that Russia and China couldn't increase the quality and quantity of these weapons, which is why I think it's so important the Department of War is prioritizing homeland defense through Golden Dome. I think one thing we should always be emphasizing is how much Chinese military writings talk about our reliance on the electromagnetic spectrum and how it really underpins a lot of our command and control and our sensing networks, just how vulnerable it is to disruption. And so when I'm thinking about, from the deterrence perspective for U.S. homeland defense, how can we almost future-proof our sensing architecture to make sure that it can be resilient to future investments that we expect Russia and China to make in these offensive weapons?
Yeah, I think we as a country have a sacred obligation to give our troops and the commanders the critical technology that they need to win on the battlefield. We don't want to go into a fair fight. A lot of things I learned, I grew up in Quincy, South Boston, and everything on the playground, you wouldn't want to go into a fight with, you have a reach of 2 feet, and your opponent has 6 feet, and they can hit you much faster. So when you start thinking about those type things, it's like, hey, we want to make sure our combatant commanders have what they need to get the job done. And if they do, I could see a lot of scenarios we were in. If we had this capability, there would have been a great deterrence capability there. So it's just something that we want to make sure that our combatant commanders have in their quiver, and they can use it when they need to use it.
Great. And I think that's something so important that comes out for the report, too, that these capabilities are important, not just because we feel like we need to match our adversaries one for one, but because they close a gap in our strategy for addressing the threats that our adversaries pose that other similar systems can't quite do the right way. So it's not just about having bigger, flashier, faster missiles, but there's a real operational concept tied to it. Let's move on to another key point that the report makes, which is a distinction between the first generation of hypersonic systems, which we have in research and development and are beginning to field now, and a second generation of systems that this report envisions, both some that are cheaper and more expendable, and others that are reusable hypersonic capabilities. And I'll go in the same order, but talk me through how you see the importance between the distinction between those 2 generations of systems and why it's so important that we move on to the second generation from where we are now.
Thanks, Mark. If you look at the portfolio of systems that we have developed and that are ready to field, they are very, very capable systems, and they're very sophisticated. And they are complex and expensive in some regards, but they're really first of their kind systems. And so we're transitioning developmental prototypes where we were exploring the technology space, pushing the envelope, and we've turned those into weapons. And they are very capable weapons. I used to always use the term, let's go from building Lamborghinis to Ford F-150s, right? And so really, if I were to modify that, I want to go from a Lamborghini to a Corvette, right? So I can build a damn good sports car. It might not be able to beat a Lamborghini, but I can do it for $60,000 or $70,000 versus $250,000 or $300,000. And so where's that sweet spot in the affordability capability spectrum that allows us to field capacity as well as capability? And now that we've got this first generation of systems essentially ready to be fielded, we need to do that aggressively, give the warfighter, again, with speed of acquisition, as good a capability as we've got today, while we move to deliver the capacity needed for the future. There are a lot of targets that need to be addressed, and many of them require capable hypersonic systems, and we need to start building to that capacity and that breadth of target space, and doing so affordably. And we have to change the mindset to do that. We have to start with cost. We got to say, I want a missile that's going to cost this much. And I've been involved in programs where when we did that, it completely changed the perspective in industry, and it completely changed the way we thought about building things. And so we got to kind of find a way to get rid of the traditional culture and look at more of the commercial space or commercial automobile mindset, and build to cost and deliver capability, affordable capacity moving forward.
Thank you, Mike. Whitney?
Most of my cost considerations have to do around leveraging commercial sector innovation and how do we invest in that test infrastructure. I think both live and virtual test infrastructure have had historically difficult time in the Department of Defense. And these are real areas where I think we could find cost savings, but I think something we'll elaborate on a little later.
Great, thank you. General Conville, how would you explain to our audience the critical difference between the first generation systems and what the second generation needs to bring to bear?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think it's really important we field the first system. A lot of times we're trying to get to perfect. My philosophy is get the alpha model out there, make sure we get it. It's just, when you look at some of our other weapon systems, the Apache helicopter, the Abrams tank, and those, systems that were maybe 30, 40 years old, and each time, each increment, we've learned a lot about the system. It's a much better system. Secretary McCarthy talked about, kind of what the force has to actually learn how to use these missile systems effectively. It's great that you have range. It's great that you have speed. It's great you have precision. But how do you bring this into your command and control systems? If you're going to do long-range fires, you better be able to do long-range targeting. And you better have a system out there that can help you bring that all together. Now, we often talk about speed, and everyone's using different ideas for speed, how fast the missile goes, how fast we can bring it to the system. But the other thing is how fast you can make decisions. If it takes a long time to work your way through how you can do the system, that takes time. The other thing I'm excited about, I have new life in private equity and venture capital. There's very smart people out there trying to disrupt how we do hypersonics. And that's really important because, I don't know, we fielded the first system in the Army. It was not cheap. It was, and at that price, you're not going to be fielding the numbers that we think we need to do. So we need to learn how to use the system, train our troops, institutionalize it into our, combatant command systems. Then at the same time, on the acquisition side, procurement side, we need to cut the costs so we can start getting the mass that we need.
Thank you, sir. And a reminder to our audience that we will be taking audience Q&A at the end of this panel, so please go to askac.org and submit your questions along with your name and affiliation, and we'll put some of those in toward the end here. Mike, this came up a bit in the first panel. In the report, you introduced a concept called integrated comprehensive layered defeat. Give us a little bit of an idea of why you think that idea is so important now, and connect it to the Golden Dome initiative, which is not just about missile defeat and defense, but all of missile defeat.
Right. So comprehensive layered defeat really came about as a notion back when I was at the Applied Physics Laboratory and participated in an Air Force Scientific Advisory Board study. And what we quickly found was that no matter how sophisticated your defenses are, if you're talking about just kinetic defenses against a determined adversary, you get overwhelmed by numbers in a big hurry. And so you have to do something to degrade, destroy, deny the adversary's ability to bring effects that can attack or disable our systems. And so to do that, you have to think about it more comprehensively. And in air defense, we always talk about layered defense. And so you think about comprehensive layers. And so you have to make sure that you do kinetic and non-kinetic defense after launch, and you do so with a layered defense approach. But your best defense is a good offense. You have to be able to deny launch, especially if you're facing large numbers. And you have to be able to go after those numbers before they launch, so we don't have to have as many quivers in our arrow as they have weapons, because we'll never get there from here. And so left of launch became a big part of it, and left of launch effective kinetic strike, and the hypersonics brings that to bear, as well as left of launch non-kinetic strike, whether, and Secretary James referenced this earlier, whether it's cyber or the space denial or whatever our left of launch capabilities might be. And so you have to look at it from a quadrant perspective, left and right of launch, kinetic, non-kinetic. And then you have to have an integrating strategy and integrating combat system architecture that pulls that all together, that maximizes efficiency to be able to handle the numbers and the capabilities that we face in a missile defense environment. So that's why when you say relate to Golden Dome, as we do Golden Dome, we have to not only think kinetic defense, even kinetic defense in layers. It needs to be a comprehensive layered defense approach, integrated with offensive and defensive capabilities, as well as kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities.
And then the high-speed nature of the weapons is so important to closing those kill chains, or those kill webs, as General Confill introduced me to that term, within speed of relevance.
Absolutely. I mean, in order to do effective kinetic strike, you have to be able to be effective in a highly contested environment. And as you go into these A2AD environments, there's significant layered defenses on their side you have to overcome. And our traditional strike systems simply aren't adequate to do that. And so in the near term, as we field our first generation systems, the kinetic capabilities of those hypersonic systems can be enablers for the traditional systems. So they, I made up a term called decontesting the environment. The hypersonic systems can go after the high-end defensive nodes that allow us more effectively to bring our traditional mass to the fight, so that we can do effective left of launch defeat.
And the task force put out a number of interim products in addition to our final report today, and one of them was a close look at how hypersonic weapons can have that decontesting function, and ultimately that's an argument for their cost effectiveness as well. It's not, you don't have to assign a hypersonic weapon to every target, it's just enough so that our traditional force can perform as designed. So I encourage folks to take a look at that memo as well as the final report. General Confill, my next question is for you. During your time in the Army, as Secretary McCarthy made reference to, long-range precision strike, long-range fires became a major priority for the Army again after being less of a priority for many years. Walk us through why that decision was made at the time and why you think the Army needs to be back in the business of long-range strike.
Well, I think when it comes down, it's all about options. And when you look at it, what we're trying to do is, and sometimes there's roles and which service should be doing what. But from where I sit, we wanted to have a capability from the ground, just like we have from the sea and from the air. What you want to do is you want to give that commander multiple options. Never want to be a one-option commander. And if we can do things from the ground, and we can do things from the air, and we can do things from the sea, then you look at the dilemmas that you're presenting, your enemy or your competitor, and it makes them think. They can't shut down one domain, multiple ways. And it was really important too is the role that space is going to play. We have a new Space Force, and when you start thinking about how we're going to have this capability. And we talked about Golden Dome, and that's very, very important. And I think Mike did a good job of laying that thing out. It's a layered defense, and we're learning as you've seen a lot of attacks across the Middle East and some other places, and then all of a sudden you go, wow, there were 100 ballistic missiles, 50 cruise missiles, 150 drones, all going to one place. And when you start thinking about how do we stop something like that, and when that attack is that much bigger, well, it becomes a challenge of bringing a whole bunch of sensors together. And you got to gather that information. You've got to be able to look at, as Mike talked about, a layered type defense, and you start categorizing those systems coming at you. And then you have different arrows in the quivers, and hypersonics capability, or whether it's Patriot, whether it's THAAD, you're going to have all these different capabilities, whether it's lasers that you can use artificial intelligence through a command system to take out these type systems. And I like the idea of also having an offensive capability. So not only are we going to defend, don't go into your office, Mr. Enemy, because Mr. Hypersonic Missile may show up there and doing those type things. So you start to get an idea that if you attack us in a certain way, we're going to destroy all your systems coming in, but we're also going to respond and hold you responsible for that. And I think that's how you get the deterrence.
And many of those targets are the ones that are the hardened ones or the most heavily defended ones anyway, so that's why part of the value is of having these capabilities to go after them in the first place.
All about options.
All about options. All right, Whitney, I'll turn to you next for a question. You mentioned test and evaluation in your earlier answer, and I want to draw you out more on that. Test and evaluation, as our report notes, can be a bottleneck in the development of these systems and has a potential to drive up the costs. Help our audience understand why that is and what we can do to reduce that bottleneck.
Well, one, I think my panelists unknowingly set me up for just the imperative behind why test and evaluation is so important. The scenarios that they lay out of what right looks like, if they sound complex, it's because they're highly, highly complex. They work on interdependencies of multiple disparate systems that rely on lots of different data, physics data. We want to integrate AI, we want to integrate non-kinetics. I mean, how do we think about deploying that with, a lot of confidence in its operational that it's going to work like we want it to work. And I think the big piece of that is test and evaluation, which you're right, Mark, really seen as like an extra layer of bureaucracy or an extra layer of process. But really when we're talking about specifically the digital infrastructure required to manage a lot of the data flow and verify a lot of the communication between these, this should be something that's done concurrently as you're building a program from the ground up. I mean, hypersonic weapons, of course, need to be tested in live ranges. And I would say, both live testing ranges and digital infrastructure are things that the department struggles with writ large, right? Our live training ranges were built in the 70s and 80s. And if we were to update them for today's threats, that would be prohibitively expensive. And of course, hypersonic weapons have very bespoke needs. We need to have flight corridors for test flights. We need specialized ground facilities that can simulate, right, pressure, speed, heat that weapons would see after launch. So that investment is meaningful. That investment would be meaningless if you did not have the digital infrastructure being built up side by side to be able to capture all of the data that we currently have when we're doing physical live testing of hypersonic weapons. A lot of that data is now sitting siloed. It's not being used to sort of increase the virtuous cycle of innovation for learning lessons about how we can increase time cycles and increase innovation cycles. So there's one thing here where this is not unique to hypersonics. I think folks still look at digital infrastructure for test and evaluation as heavy, but it is an investment that once you've made up front, that it actually can unlock much better performance and lower cost over time, and is a really critical part when we're thinking about building up a hypersonics portfolio.
Great, thanks for that, Whitney. And if you want to read a great report on what the Department of Defense needs to do to better integrate that sort of technology and acquire it, I'd encourage you to read Whitney's chapters in our Commission on Software-Defined Warfare, which talks about many of these same things. Okay, I see some great questions from the audience coming in. Please keep
Mark,
those.
Mark, I'm sorry, can I just jump on that?
Please go for it.
Well, I want to acknowledge the work that TRMC is doing in the department as being kind of the integrating driver behind the nation's test and evaluation infrastructure. So they're making key investments in facilities, flight test capabilities, flight test ranges. But what Whitney said is really important. They're also now trying to bring that digital ecosystem into the physical world and tie it together and unlock some of the capabilities that we can represent digitally as we not only increase our ground test capability, but we increase our flight test cadence. And now we're flying, as an example, we're flying routinely a reusable hypersonic test vehicle. And as we get more capable, both in the air as well as on the ground, getting that digital infrastructure pulled together. I think TRMC has a program called HyperCore where they're, in fact, their goal is to do that. So they've done a nice job pulling that all together.
Great, thanks for adding that, Mike. One more question I have for each of you before I start to bring in some of the audience questions is, while our report, of course, is very positive on the topic of hypersonic weapons, there are critics out there who don't believe that the department should be prioritizing these. I think we've adequately covered the cost question, but there are at least two other kinds of objections I see out there. One on the idea that other weapons can achieve these effects just as well, and hypersonics are further out or more expensive than those alternatives. And some people raise questions about stability, about the potential destabilizing nature of these weapons as how they might be perceived by our adversaries. I'd ask each of our panelists to give a riposte to that. Why do you think that the critics are wrong or overstating their case? And General McConville, maybe I'll start with you.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
I was looking at Mike go first.
Okay, well, Mike, do you want to give a crack at it?
He wrote the report, though, but I get.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it, Mike.
Sure.
Okay. So I've been doing this stuff for like almost 50 years now. I started when I was 4, of course, but it's almost 50 years now. And there are always critics, right? And there are a lot of dimensions and vectors that the critics try to attack from. For years, it was, the popular criticism was it costs too much, and if you've never really flown before, right? We've taken care of that. You've never really flown before. We've got systems and weapon systems that have been demonstrated that have awesome capabilities. In each case, we're doing things beyond what the design capability was for. So we've got the systems, the technology is understood. We're flying hypersonic weapon systems as we speak. They are more expensive than traditional weapon systems still. And so as we drive affordability into these first-of-kind, prototype transitioned capabilities, it will address that affordability challenge. So we're working those two vectors, but there are other less firm objectives. One of them is it'll disrupt someone's rice bowl, right? So anytime you do something that's transformational or disruptive, you create antibodies and you create people who don't want to see you be successful. And one of the most important aspects, I think, of the recommendation about a weapons czar is that the services, and General McConville, no offense, the services are very platform-centric, right? The Air Force wants to build airplanes, the Navy wants to build ships. Yeah, they have weapons programs, but as soon as those multi-billion-dollar, decade-long acquisition programs run into financial trouble, the weapon systems tend to become bill payers for the services. And the Army wants to build whatever you guys build, tanks or whatever, So there's a kind of this institutional inertia that you have to overcome to make weapons a priority over platforms. I used to tell the Air Force, the only thing an airplane's ever killed is the pilot. Right? If it's not carrying weapons, nobody cares. And so you have to make sure that you prioritize delivering effects versus I want to build the next generation of stealth manned platform. So there's some organizational and cultural barriers that tend to get in the way of transformational capabilities as well. And so I think as General McConville said, as we field this first generation system, we train the warfighter how to use them in conjunction with the traditional systems, how to use them as enablers for the traditional systems. We'll be able to start to address some of that resistance, natural resistance, and it will be embraced and recognized as a truly transformational and enabling capability for our force in the future.
Thank you, Mike. Winnie, do you want to come in on the stability part or the other capabilities?
I would say, is it overstated? I think Russia and China get a vote here, right? And I think that's the big thing that, maybe isn't always part of the conversation. I mean, hypersonic weapons offer a lot of unpredictability. They offer the ability to cut through a lot of the, I think Debbie James was talking about this, right? The survivability in contested environments. I mean, the whole reason we could argue that China and Russia invested in A2AD networks, right, is to keep us at bay. I think procuring a weapon that could cut through that and survive and hit its target is pretty compelling. I also think, too, it could add another rung on the escalation ladder. I think maybe to our detriment, the U.S. strategic culture has messaged, just a real reticence to ever use nuclear weapons. We're definitely not saber rattlers like Russia and China in that sense. And so I do think it's compelling to be developing a weapon that is very destructive, long range, survivable through contested and congested environments. But one that we've signaled that we're not as reticent to use as the next rung. And so I think in terms of cost and whether or not it's worth it, I think the first question should be, do we find it compelling enough? And if so, we'll find a way to get the cost to a palatable place.
Good. Do you want to take some of those questions?
Yeah, I do, because we were thinking about this. I was looking at some of the questions coming out. Why did we wait on this? Well, we didn't need a whole lot of hypersonic missiles for Afghanistan. We just weren't shooting a whole lot of them. And so as you take a look at where the service is going to invest, and we also had this thing, and I think Secretary McCarthy mentioned about the INF Treaty and keeping, and we can have discussion about where the hypersonics fall underneath that. But it was just a philosophy that we didn't need long-range fires in those cases. And I would say, again, kind of what I said before is, when we should not let our potential adversaries have systems that we don't have for our troops. And that gives us the opportunity to do this. We've had this technology for quite a while. That's why we're able to move quickly once we focused on the systems. And again, we want to make sure that we give our troops the capabilities they need to win on the battlefield. And hopefully, because they can demonstrate, you win without fighting, you do it by demonstrating you can win by fighting. And if we can demonstrate that we can win by fighting, then we can have deterrence.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we're in the home stretch of the event now, so please keep submitting your questions, and I'd like to take the first one now. I just switched. Okay, well, Vlad from Bravo Ventures Intelligence Hub asks, may I ask about hypersonic lessons learned from ongoing conflicts? For example, has Russia's use of hypersonic weapons in Ukraine informed the United States' own research and development in hypersonic technology and doctrinal use? Would any of you like to take that?
I'll just, being careful here, as you look at the employment of hypersonic weapons and kind of what you call hypersonic weapons, we have to be a little bit careful because the Russians tend to want to call a air-launched ballistic missile a hypersonic weapon. There's a difference in that hypersonic weapons, in the way we define them, are able to have a significant portion of their trajectory in the atmosphere and maneuver for survivability and to deliver effects reliably. And so you have to really understand the difference. A ballistic missile is a ballistic missile. We have ballistic missile defense systems that are designed to shoot down ballistic missiles. And so if you call a ballistic missile a hypersonic weapon and it gets shot down, you're shooting down a ballistic missile. You're not shooting down a hypersonic weapon. So I think there are some lessons learned. Unfortunately, if you look at some of the successes that we might have had in Ukraine against the Russian Kinzhal, if you shoot one down, someone said, well, maybe hypersonics weapons aren't invincible after all, right? So they tend, you get this label hypersonic. We labeled this thing hypersonic, and we were able to shoot it down. So that means hypersonics is now vulnerable. Hypersonics isn't a thing; it's a characteristic of flight. And so you have to really look at it system by system and understand the specific characteristics of the systems you're developing. And I'm confident the systems we're developing are much more capable than what we've seen used in the wars.
Well, glad to hear that as an American. Do our other panelists want to take that question, or shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I'll just take a shot. I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons being learned from Ukraine, and what they have done is absolutely incredible, heroic. But I would also argue or suggest, don't learn too many lessons. I see that. When I was a chief, it was like, hey, we had, the Russians had trouble with tanks, so McConville, you don't need armor anymore. And it's like, I was like, yeah, we don't need it unless we want to win. And, so when you start thinking about these type things, you solve the problem. If there's a drone problem on maneuver forces, then you solve the drone problem so you can maneuver forces. And I think sometimes rather than just saying, hey, get rid of this thing, let's take a look at, the different systems that we have and the capability that we have with pilots that can fly at night, pilots can fly in systems, how we can integrate, man, unmanned teaming with fires and support, with layered offense, layered defense, and use the systems we have to tie this all together and then bring those maneuver forces so you're not, I would say stuck in trench warfare, if you will. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we are learning and we should be learning from what's happening in Ukraine, but at the same time, we ought to be taking a look at the systems we have and optimize them so we can get into the maneuver warfare that we're used to.
We have to be careful that what we learn over here, we don't apply over here if it's not applicable, right? I mean, there are different factors in different theaters that need to be accounted for.
Absolutely.
A little more water in the Indo-Pacific, at least from my sea.
Good. Whitney, do you want to round this out, or shall we move on to the next one?
Not over learning lessons was the big takeaway. And I think, too, it's like it's not just measure, countermeasure, but, did they send something less operationally capable to see how the defenses would do? Are they using a weapon and calling it hypersonic to see how we react? Are we deterred to get involved in Ukraine? And there's a lot more going on, just the weapon being used, yeah.
Good. Well, we have a great next question from Matt McGregor, who asks, how do we get the services to budget for this capability? What should be deprioritized to make room? And hopefully the DRPM for munitions would help do those trade-offs, but what are your answers to Matt's question?
You want me to take that since I was a service chief?
Yeah.
How do you get the Army the budget? You gave them the money and you directed them to spend it on hypersonics, and that's what we did.
That's what we did.
Basically, it was a priority at that time when Secretary McCarthy and I were there, and they said, we want you to have hypersonics, and the money came, and that's how we did it. It would have been a little more challenge if they said, okay, you're not getting the money. If you want to get something done, you put someone in charge of it, you make sure that they're responsible and accountable, and you make sure they have the resources to do that, and we were given the resources and the authority to do it, and we were able to move out rather quickly on that.
I'm no budgeting expert. I would argue for a 50% increase in the defense budget. But I will say, I think the reason the cost is so high is because we are not signaling properly to industry that this is a priority. I think if we were to start moving things to a program of record and looking at it at scale, putting funding to scale it, we'd see capital dollars flowing from all parts of industry into ways to make the price cheaper and more palatable for the services to start buying it at scale.
I'll just echo what General McConville said. I mean, all the money for the first generation systems we added to the service budgets. And we said, we were directive. We said, here, Army, you get this much money, go build LRHW. And oh, by the way, here's more money. We want 2 more batteries, right? And so it was an interesting exercise, right? I remember briefing the secretary on our acceleration plan where we increased our investment pretty significantly. And all the services were very lukewarm on it because they didn't want to get stuck with the bill. We want the capability, but this or but that. And it took us a while to convince them that there was this holdback money and they were going to get additional money above their top line. And once they recognized that, then it was fully embraced. That new acceleration plan was fully embraced. So you can't expect the services to do miracles and to take priorities for their core mission to do something that's transformational and different. You have to really jumpstart it.
Great. We have a question here from Sebastian Marin, who is a Minister of Parliament to the Romanian Parliament, who asks, we've been a target of Russian aggression for a long time, especially since the war in Ukraine. Could the United States deploy or share with Romania hypersonic weapons in order to strengthen its defense posture? So we're going to build all of these things. Where should we put them, and can we forward deploy them to our allies, and what challenges might you see in doing that? Happy for any of you to jump in on that.
I'll let you start with that.
Can we take that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, but there was always that discussion with long-range fires that who's going to allow you to put them into the country? And my response was, when it's first of all, it's in our interest, and when it's in their interest, they will allow you to position long-range fires. And you can look around the Pacific, and there's some of the systems that people said they wouldn't allow in the country, and I would suggest there's other countries who may not want to speak publicly about it. But when it's in their interest to have long-range fires protect their people, they're going to put them in there.
Great. Did either of you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, I think the important thing is, and one of the main reasons why we prioritized a set of first-generation systems that were air, land, and sea launched, is so that we have that fielding option. Where we might have access might not be exactly where we want. We have ship options. We have airborne options. So as General McConville said earlier, keep your options open. Make sure that you're not vulnerable to certain denial aspects of a single point failure. And so we try to do that by fielding all 3 modalities.
Whitney, did you want anything there, or shall we move on?
covered it.
All right. Another great question from the audience. This one's from Jonathan Sharma at Northrop Grumman, who asks, the report talks about how advanced our development of hypersonic technology was. So what did our adversaries do to beat us to fielding this capability? Was our test infrastructure lacking? Were programs not funded? Or were we overly ambitious? And there is a long history of development in this space, an advantage that maybe we lost. So I don't know if, Mike, if you want to regale us with the history a bit in our last minute and tell us why you think this time's different.
A little bit PTSD here, but we were world leaders in research, but we never had the commitment to transition that research to delivered capability. First of all, because we knew it wasn't going to be cheap to make that leap. You know, it was kind of the valley of death thing, and we'd get close and we'd go back and get close and come back. And the thing that's different this time is the adversaries have spoken. They've changed the dynamic on the battlefield. They're delivering capability, and they have effects that they can deliver in minutes when it takes us hours or days to reply. And General McConville's analogy was perfect about the boxers. I just have a slight variation on that. Is we'll end up in a conflict where it'll be like Sugar Ray Leonard fighting a 90-year-old man, and we're going to be the 90-year-old man because they'll be able to punch us 5, 6, 7 times before we get our first punch off. And we just can't allow that asymmetry to persist. We have to be able to be reactive and be able to respond in a time scale of relevance and deliver effects that matter.
Good. Linnea, General McConville, any closing thoughts on why this time's different?
I just think that we're taking a look at great power competition, whatever we want to call. When the strategy come out, you take a look around, and it's just a much different situation. Great power competition doesn't mean there's going to be great power conflict, but the way you avoid that, I'm a firm believer in the philosophy of peace through strength. President Reagan gave that speech at my West Point graduation in 1981, and I think that's a good philosophy. And I say that's an apolitical philosophy, so I'm not advocating anything, but the idea that peace through strength is what we want. Those of us who have served with people in combat and send our sons and daughters to combat, we really believe in the fact that deterrence is the way ahead.
Whitney, anything in closing to take us home?
This time is different if we want it to be, and I think our other panelists said that the Department of War can do hard things if it wants to.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for joining us here in person and online, and thank you very much to our panelists as well as to everyone else who served on this task force. We're proud to have the report out and hope you'll give it a good read. On behalf of the Atlanta Council, thank you.
Thank you.